Far More Than We Think, Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 32, Beyond Belief. Proof of Heaven is a personal account by Dr. Ibn Alexander of what is known as a near-death experience. The title is perhaps a little bold, but the story is compelling and worth summarizing here as an important piece of supporting evidence for spirituality. I accept, of course, that the story can be nothing other than anecdotal, but there is nevertheless a strong scientific flavour to it. Alexander is a neurosurgeon who suffered a highly unusual attack of E. coli meningitis that left him in a coma and brain dead for 7 days. During the coma he was consciously aware of his existence and experienced a journey into higher realms that frankly seems beyond belief. What is unique and interesting about this story is that prior to this experience his beliefs were firmly grounded in scientific fact, and he had always assumed that near-death experiences were the product of vivid imagination or hallucinations brought on by the release of hormones into the brain. In his case, he had no conscious brain with which to imagine or hallucinate anything, because it had completely shut down. He has reviewed all the data from the brain monitoring equipment at the time, and there was no doubt he was brain dead. Whether we believe the precise details of his subsequent journey, there still remains a pretty compelling case for the existence of consciousness that is independent of the body and mind. As a brain surgeon, Alexander has a strong scientific background and a specialist knowledge of the workings of the brain. As far as I know, he was already a successful man and had no need for celebrity or financial gain. And he clearly had nothing to gain professionally by holding himself up to potential ridicule, by making claims that hitherto he himself would have rejected without a second thought. What we have then is a credible witness whose own beliefs have been turned completely on their head by what was undoubtedly a life-changing experience. His stated purpose is to share this experience with the world, because he believes it is of fundamental importance to all of us. Society in general seems to trust doctors and scientists to provide us with the real truth about life, whereas spiritual teachers are often treated with an understandable dose of skepticism. There is logic and reliability to science that appeals to our minds far more than esoteric mystical ideas. There's also a widespread assumption that science and spirituality cannot be reconciled, and that we have to choose one or the other. This belief prevents many people from even a cursory review of the growing evidence that the two concepts can, and indeed do, sit comfortably together. Alexander can be seen as a spiritual poacher turned gamekeeper, in that his own views have shifted completely from a position where science precluded spirituality to a total certainty that higher realms really do exist. He is an embodiment of the trusted doctor and scientist, and he is making an unequivocal statement, not only that science and spirituality can coexist, but that the universal energy of life is the reality that underpins all of science. This is why I believe his story is worthy of serious consideration. One of the consequences of the incredible advances in modern healthcare is that doctors are able to use technology to keep patients alive far longer and in more extreme circumstances than ever before. People are being kept artificially alive using life support systems when previously they would have died. People who survive such experiences often have a story to tell, and there's been an explosion of reported near-death experiences where patients have lived to tell the tale. Our understanding of the possibility of life after death is therefore growing as science progresses. We are potentially evolving through science, but these ideas are yet to gain a foothold in mainstream thinking. We continue to believe that consciousness is the result of the physical matter of our minds, rather than the other way round. Once we grasp the idea that physical matter arises from universal energy, or consciousness, then the experience that Alexander describes makes much more sense. What he seems to have experienced is the return of his spirit to the source, exactly in accordance with the spiritual beliefs that have been around for millennia. The journey that he describes from his coma covers three distinct stages or realms. The first was a dark, gelatinous subterranean world, and the second was a beautifully vivid and colourful landscape that he effectively flew through towards a gateway. The third realm lay beyond the gateway and was described by him as the core. This realm was an infinite void that was pitch black, yet very comforting. An angelic creature had accompanied him on his journey through the beautiful scenery of the second realm, and this angel, or orb, guided him in the core by emitting brilliant light. He saw nothing in the core, but he did experience a sound, which he describes as Om, and he felt the presence of omniscient and omnipotent love. He eventually returned to the subterranean world, and having completed the journey once, was then able to move from one realm to the next at will, whilst at the same time being totally accepting of wherever he was at any given moment. In terms of the feelings experienced, he describes a sense of timelessness, belonging, acute reality, unconditional love, irony, and even humour. His physical senses seemed to merge into a single sense, and he felt able to absorb all that was going on around him. Everything seemed simultaneously to be separate, yet all part of one thing. At times he felt so much part of everything that he experienced being everything. His thoughts felt incredibly tangible and immediate, and he was able to ask questions and receive answers in real time. There were no words used, yet he felt he had access to infinite knowledge. Having experienced such infinite knowledge, he now realizes how difficult it is to describe such things using the limitations of human language. The feeling he recalls most of all is unconditional love, and he describes the very fabric of the spiritual realms as being comprised of love and compassion. The key messages that he recalls from his experience were that we are all loved and cherished for all time, that we have nothing to fear, that there is nothing that we can do wrong, that free will is the basis for growth, that evil exists only as a consequence of free will, that other universes exist but are not accessible by human senses, and that unconditional love is the ultimate reality and foundation of all that is. Other universes or dimensions are part of the overall divine reality, and it's possible to access lower dimensions from above, but not the other way round, unless practices are undertaken to transcend human experience. He understood clearly that he was part of all that is, and that nothing could ever change that reality, and he saw that believing in the possibility of such separation was the basis of all fear. The good news for Ibn Alexander, and for all of us, is that he did eventually return to his physical earthly existence. Interestingly, he describes suffering frighteningly vivid dreams and hallucinations upon his return, but is able to clearly distinguish these in his own mind from his spiritual journey. He also describes his return as being like squeezing into a tight suit of physical existence, and notes the restrictive nature of spatio-temporal limits, simple thinking, and human languages. Since returning to life and documenting his story, he's done a great deal of research into near-death experiences and spirituality in general. He makes many points in his book that resonate with what I've already come to believe through my own experience of a spiritual awakening and my subsequent journey of discovery. He identifies the ego brain as the barrier to higher knowledge, because we filter what we see through our own minds. But he also sees the purpose of ego as placing us in the dark so that we can grow back towards the light and hence evolve. He sees a massive gap between what he experienced and the current scientific understanding of the universe. He acknowledges that the physical universe that we see is a tiny fraction of the invisible and spiritual whole. He identifies, as I do, the ultimate irony that it's the precious gift of free will that permits the existence of evil in the first place, but goes on to say that the influence of evil on earth is greater than in the higher realms. Presumably, this is because humankind is not yet sufficiently evolved to choose love instead of fear. He singles out growth towards the divine as our role on earth, and concludes that it's our thinking that prevents us from doing this. True thought is independent of the physical mind and should really be the function of the spirit rather than the brain. He describes spirit rather eloquently as the thinking behind the thinking, and he concludes that the human brain is pedestrian compared to spiritual thought. It's only when we set aside normal thinking that we can access this far greater power. He sees how living without fear of being judged means there's no need to pursue wealth, celebrity, or power. He talks about manifesting love and compassion as the way to grow closer to our true spiritual selves, and of moving from defensiveness to openness. He reflects on the difficulty of grasping the non-existence of time, and now understands why spiritual writing can often seem nonsensical when it tries to explain such concepts. Alexander goes on to express views about how the progress of science and the development of Western culture has taken humankind away from spiritual traditions and wisdom, which were previously well known and practiced. He contrasts the convenience of modern progress with the heavy price in terms of lack of spirituality, urban blight, ecological damage, and the inequitable distribution of economic resources. He sees how skeptics will judge something as impossible without even bothering to look at the evidence, and goes so far as to say that those who assert that there is no evidence for spiritual phenomena are willfully ignorant. He reflects on the irony that consciousness is so near at hand, yet humankind knows far more about the physicality of the universe than it does about how to access the basis of all that exists. He describes our human experience as constrained by our senses and by our perceptions of the macro and micro nature of physical matter. He sees the evolutionary need for us to open up to that which is within. He reassuringly notes that nothing can touch the truth of our eternal existence, whatever the struggles and suffering of the world may be. He warns against overthinking and grasping for spirituality, and highlights instead the need to let go and allow the personal journey to unfold. He sees that we are all connected through a divine link to the source of all that is, and he believes that what he went through is of stunning importance, not only to him, but to all of us. He sees himself as living proof that spirit exists and that there is life after death. Now, all of these insights and beliefs come from a man who, as a doctor and scientist, was highly skeptical of spiritual matters and relied entirely on humankind's understanding of science to shape his belief system. His dramatic change of heart is an exact reflection of what has happened to me during my spiritual journey. I have no difficulty in identifying with him without any skepticism. You may see it differently, but that will be your choice. My focus so far has been on how I believe Alexander's experience validates many of the spiritual principles in this book, but of course the overarching message of his story is that there is life after death. I always used to think that belief in life after death was the ultimate form of wishful thinking, and it was not part of my agnostic belief system. I believed in my own willpower to propel me through life, and this did not extend to propelling myself upwards into heaven. In fact, heaven was never an option for me, given all the guilt and shame that I carried due to my mistakes, dishonesty, and the hurt I caused those nearest and dearest. Since my spiritual awakening, I now see life after death as a totally logical extension of the spiritual wisdom that I've discovered and experienced. I identify myself primarily as a tiny drop of the universal energy of life, which is manifested into the physical form that I see in the mirror. This tiny drop of universal energy is part of all that is, and exists in the eternal moment of now, and is itself eternal. There's no death of the spirit, but simply a momentary manifestation in physical form, and then a return to the source. Our physical lives are temporary, but our existence is permanent. This is the only logical conclusion from my emerging understanding of spirituality, and for me it's not a belief, but an absolute certainty. The interesting thing about Alexander's story is not so much that it adds certainty to what was already certain in my mind, but rather that he provides lucid detail of his experience. Not only can I be sure that there will be life after death, it seems it's all going to be rather splendid. The key message, therefore, is that there's nothing to fear. Losing my fear of death has further transformed my experience of life. However physically safe I may feel, the reality is I could die at any moment in any number of ways. We all assume that we're invincible, but accidents or health problems can and do arise suddenly and without warning. Losing my fear of death means I can walk freely in the world, knowing that I may die at any moment, but not fearing it. Once we add losing the fear of death to the long list of other fears that melt away through spiritual practice, we move towards total freedom. There's nothing to prove, nobody to impress, nothing more that we need, and no reason to fear. This is the real proof of heaven. This is heaven on earth. Once we believe our spirit will return to source upon the death of our physical body and mind, our thoughts naturally turn to consider what may then happen. Many schools of spiritual thought include the idea of reincarnation, with the theory being that we keep coming back in order to have another go at life and to learn more and more, and thereby contribute to evolution. My own mind is far from clear on this, so I don't have much more to say, but it is interesting to note the prevalence of death and rebirth in the natural world. The whole universe is in a constant flux of death and rebirth, whether it be the stars and planets, or the hibernation of a tree during winter. The entire universe is a massively gigantic system of recycling, with energy and matter constantly changing form and frequency. Recycling and evolution are the key components of life, so it seems entirely plausible that this should apply to human beings too. In fact, it makes no sense that humans should be excluded. We are part of all that is. Life is all the same thing, manifesting itself in countless billions of different and unique ways. And reincarnation is nothing but recycling. Several ancient belief systems incorporate the concept of death and rebirth. We're all familiar with the idea of plants dying down or burning in order to encourage subsequent stronger growth. In order to grow ourselves, the idea is that we allow our old selves to die in order for the new, stronger person to emerge. The old self in this context is the ego, that we usually hold on to for dear life. The temptation is to get to a certain point and be comfortable with ourselves, thinking that we've got life all figured out. But ancient wisdom tells us that we can keep moving forwards in our growth. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, or a butterfly emerging from the remnants of the cocoon, we can keep allowing ourselves to die inside so that the next version of ourselves can emerge and flourish. I personally find this concept comforting and exciting because firstly it means there's no end point or target to reach, and secondly it means that our individual potential for growth is limitless. We have infinite possibility for ascending to higher and higher levels of consciousness and to experience more and more of the wonder and beauty of life. We all have the potential for our lives to get better and better. There's no end to the possibilities. When we die to death and die to our own egos, there's nothing left to fear. If we live the process of resurrection, life unfolds in front of our very eyes. Our childlike fears melt away and are replaced by the maturity of wisdom. We are willing, and indeed happy, to unlearn that which does not serve us and replace it with new ideas for growth. Our lives become instruments of love rather than victims and purveyors of fear. Facing the reality of death teaches us that material possessions are temporary and that we have nothing to lose. The certainty of physical death amplifies the experience of the present moment to the point where all we see is love, whatever the circumstances or surroundings. We no longer need to justify our existence or pretend to be that which we are not. We become prepared to take risks and seek new experiences because that becomes the purpose of life. We become unafraid to live and unafraid to die. We can ascend into our own personal version of heaven once we become willing to die over and over again. When we die to death, there is nothing left to fear, and we're completely free to be truly alive. My personal view is that the compelling logic of spirituality, combined with my own observations of my early growth and the mounting evidence of near-death experience, take life after death beyond belief and into the realms of near certainty.